Hello, everybody. I am going to be going through the biological approach with this video. I am being blasted by the sun a little bit, so just ignore my massive moon head. That is actually how the moon works, though, reflecting off the sun. But biological approach today. So probably, in my opinion, one of the easiest approaches that you have to describe and evaluate. In terms of AO1, it's pretty straightforward, right? You need to know the four subsections of the biological approach. So these are the four that you are looking at: evolution, genetics, neuroanatomy, and neuro/biochemistry. So you do need to know those four. So when it comes to you describing the biological approach, these are the four you need to do. So naming them will not get any marks at all unless for some reason the exam has asked you to do that, which I doubt. You are going to need to know quite a bit of detail about all four of these. Now, the reason why this is also quite important as well is you're going to need these throughout the whole spec, right? Each of these four come up several times actually in other parts. So I will go through some examples as I go through the slides. And then what I'm going to do afterwards is just do a quick check to make sure we've got everything in the workbook as well, so that can be easily filled out. But let's make a start with evolution. You do need to know what is meant by evolution. So you do need to know natural selection here. You need to understand not so much natural selection, but more how natural selection affects our behavior. So one thing to note down with evolution is that all of our behavior is geared towards two key elements: to survive and to reproduce. Most, if not all, of your behavior, according to evolution, is geared towards these two things happening. So natural selection, for example, is geared towards survival. We look at sexual selection next year. Again, these are quite important terms to note down. So sexual selection is how we find certain characteristics and traits sexually attractive. Thus, we mate with that person, and then those characteristics carry on into our children, and therefore our children, when they grow up, the same thing is going to happen to them. So we look at this next year when we do relationships. So when do we look at this later? Evolutionary explanations for partner preferences. And it's the idea that we pick our mates. This is kind of natural and sexual selection. We pick our reproductive mates, not our friends. We pick our mates based on the genes that they offer us and the potential children that they offer us as well. So we do look at this next year in the second year. So essentially, your life partner, the person whom you may or may not spend most, if not all, of your life with, is actually partly based on our evolution, i.e., you don't choose who you are attracted to. So that's a good way to think about it, actually. And one thing to note down about the biological approach in general, by the way, is the basic concept of the biological approach is what is psychological is at first biological. It's a really, really important part of the whole biological approach. What is psychological? So anything psychological, so who you're attracted to, your motivation levels, how much self-efficacy you have, how much confidence you have, for example. What is psychological is at first biological. So a really important part to this approach is you should be able to find biological markers that indicate your confidence, for example. So if you are a very, very confident person, I should be able to find a biological foundation for that, basically. So your life partner is apparently chosen by your evolution, right? That is one part of the biological approach. Another one is your genetics. Now, this is what most people think about first when they think about the biological approach. Obviously, this is a very simplistic way of looking at it, and it's not quite 100% true, but 50% of your genes come from your father, 50% come from your mother. Is 0.1's really just random, not really from either. But This is the idea that your behavior is caused by certain genes that you have. Now, it's not just enough to go, what causes the behavior? Genes. That's not enough. You need to be able to talk about candidate genes, for example. So this is a term you definitely want to note down as well. Anything that's not on your book that I'm saying here, you should be noting down, FYI. The candidate genes are, how do I define this off the top of my head? Genes that have been specifically implicated in the onset of a behavior, right? So, for example, schizophrenia has candidate genes. OCD has candidate genes. A faulty SERT gene, for example, a COMT gene, for example, faulty COMT gene, for example. These are candidate genes. They've been specifically implicated. Nowadays, this is not enough to say it causes a behavior. So we now know for a fact that you cannot just have a gene and it cause a behavior. There needs to be an interaction with the environment that triggers the gene. So, for example, an example I often use is I know I have the gene for diabetes, type 1. I know I have that gene because my sister had diabetes. And so I know I have that gene. And it's been tested, me and my sister, and we have the gene. But me and my older sister don't have diabetes. So it's not enough to just have the gene. So one evaluation here that you definitely want to talk about is that this is only ever a partial explanation, right? The genetic explanation is only ever a partial explanation. It explains the predisposition to the behavior. It explains the vulnerability to the behavior, but it doesn't actually explain the triggering of the behavior. That sun is really starting to piss me off. Go away. Oh, go away. Oh, the blinds all the way over there. One final thing as well is genotypes. Phenotypes aren't really applicable to the biological approach. It could be argued, but well, they kind of are. But genotypes are literally the composition of genes that you have. So they are literally what genes you have, the makeup of your genes. You have a very, very arguably, possibly unique genotype. You'll have genotypes for certain hair colors. You'll have genotypes for when your metabolism slows down, probably in the mid to late 20s. You have genes for what you might find attractive, maybe, right? So genotypes is literally the genes you have, whereas phenotypes are you may want to play this back, but a phenotype is the behavior that results from the interaction between your genes and the environment. That's probably the best definition I can think of off the top of my head for genotypes. Where do we see this? Everywhere, to be honest with you, right? We look at this quite a lot. We look at this at OCD. OCD is caused partially by genes. Schizophrenia is caused partially by genes. Addiction is caused partially by genes. So any mental health disorder probably has a genetic basis, right? You may argue. The third one I want to look at is neuroanatomy. This is the one that students aren't particularly good at. It's literally the physical structure of the brain. Is there something wrong with the physical structure of the brain? It's not about genes, it's not about evolution, it's not about chemicals. It's literally, is a part of your brain broken or misfiring or underperforming? So you do need to know the lobes of the brain. You do need to know, if I get damage in my Broca's area for speech production, we're not talking about chemicals or genes or any of that faffy nonsense. Faffy nonsense. I've literally just taught you that. I'm calling it nonsense. But if I have a stroke in my Broca's area, that is going to affect a very particular behavior, in this case, production of speech. So certain parts of the brain have different roles, and we look at this later on. One area we do look at this later on is, again, schizophrenia, which has an evolutionary explanation, by the way. Schizophrenia has a genetic explanation as well. Schizophrenia also has a neuroanatomical explanation and a neurochemical explanation. So schizophrenia can be explained by biological approach in all four ways, really. But in terms of schizophrenia, it's the idea of you have enlarged ventricles in your brain, and that then goes on to cause schizophrenia. They're about 15% bigger. Ventricles are basically just these empty sacs in your brain that kind of hold everything in place. But in people with schizophrenia, they tend to be about 15% bigger. Therefore, that's what causes schizophrenia. No, it's rubbish, really. And then finally, neurochemistry, serotonin, dopamine most of the time, right? Is your behavior caused by the chemical balance of your brain in some way? Yes, of course it is, right? So how we feel a lot of the time, our emotions, our feelings, our thoughts, our processes, a lot of these are actually caused by the current level of serotonin. Like right now, you're watching this video, presumably, I don't know, you have a certain amount of serotonin in your brain right now. That is going to have an effect on your behavior, right? Every now and again, you get a student who just can't stop smiling in a class, right? It's usually a female student, and she is usually smiling, and it's really annoying, and she's just a happy person, and you just think, ugh, lower the serotonin, right? Some people have naturally higher serotonin. Some people have naturally lower serotonin. Naturally higher dopamine, naturally naturally higher dopamine. So any time, and what's probably worth knowing, any time any of these are either too high, that's a different disorder. So high dopamine causes, well, apparently schizophrenia, but low dopamine causes Parkinson's. Low serotonin causes depression, apparently, and potentially OCD, but excessively high serotonin causes aggression. So any time any of these chemicals go wrong or are naturally wrong, that's going to lead to some sort of disorder. It's quite fascinating, really. Although low serotonin, it's quite controversial to say that causes depression, really. We do look at this quite a lot. This comes up all the time, right? What you also need to know here, particularly for this one, actually, what you also need to know is that all of the ones I've talked about have practical applications. This has massive practical applications, because if you can figure out what chemicals are wrong, that's quite easy. I say easy. I've done very little towards making antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs, but that's much easier to create drug therapy than genes. If I were to identify what gene causes depression, how the bloody bejesus am I going to fix that? Right? Gene therapy, that's not going to be around for the next 10, 15 years. So this one has quite a lot of practical applications. So this is what I've said earlier. Essentially, the biological approach believes that all psychological behaviors can be traced back to a biological cause, and therefore this biological cause should be observable. You should be able to see a marker. You should be able to see this cause our psychological behaviors. I've just punched the desk and I've really injured my knuckle. Oh, bloody Nora, that hurts. So there's a couple of slides here. I'm not going to go through in too much detail. I don't really feel like I need to go through these, etc., etc. But this is a good example. This is a good example about the effect of biology. This is the effect of genes on schizophrenia. And essentially, the closer you get to the person, the closer you get in terms of relatedness to the person with schizophrenia, the more chance you have of getting schizophrenia. So basically, if your aunt gets schizophrenia, you have a 2% chance of developing schizophrenia, right? But if your identical twin who has mostly the same genes as you have a 48% chance. So the closer you are in terms of genetics to the person with schizophrenia, the more chance you are going to. You could easily counter that, by the way, and say, well, actually, the closer you are genetically to someone, the more likely you are to share their environment. But I'm not going to get into that now. So there's a few evaluations here. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these. This is a new video I'm going to go through. But one thing I do want students to work on quite a bit is know how they can elaborate on something, right? So first thing that springs to mind about the biological approach, it is scientific. Fantastic, well done. But what's the consequence of that? What's the evidence of that? Well, the evidence is the dopamine hypothesis, right? How's the dopamine hypothesis scientific? It is empirical because we can actually see the dopamine receptors have an effect on schizophrenia. So we can actually observe that. And therefore, that raises the prospect of psychology as a science, right? However, on the other hand, the biological approach ignores mediational processes. That's your point, right? Where's the evidence of this, right? So mediational processes, which you'll see in another video for learning approaches, is basically the idea about what happens between us seeing something and then repeating the behavior. Right? The biological approach ignores the power of cognition. We know how we think has an effect on our behavior. We know that for a fact, right? For a strongly supported hypothesis. But this approach completely ignores this. One thing you can say here is that the biological approach ignores individual differences. It says if you have a faulty SERT gene, then you will always have OCD. But what it fails to include is this idea about individual differences. Why is it we can put the same people in the same situation with the same genes potentially, and they react differently? Cognitive approach explains that. The biological approach does not, right? So there's a big issue. Therefore, it has low explanatory power. And then finally, however, the biological approach does promote pretty crucial practical applications, mainly drug therapy in treating depression, OCD, and most mental health disorders. But then you need to go and elaborate why that's important. The reason why that's so important, if the biological approach fixes loads of people with mental health disorders, we keep these people in the workforce. They're paying taxes, they're contributing to society, they are lowering the unemployment rate and unemployment benefit, for example. They are contributing to our society, and it's psychology that is doing that. So that's a clear evaluation here. And then finally, I have a model point here as well. So one big issue really is that the biological approach could be argued to be too simplistic, right? What's your evidence for that, right? Don't give me one sentence. Don't give me one sentence for evidence. The dopamine hypothesis is complex, and so states that the complex and multifaceted behavior of schizophrenia can be reduced down to a single variable cause. Is schizophrenia really caused by one thing, right? No. Why is that bad? Why is it bad that the approach is too simplistic? That's what your elaboration is. Why is this bad? Well, it's bad because it's quite parochial, quite narrow-minded, and that can affect the effect of the practical applications. So if you're saying that schizophrenia is caused entirely by dopamine and just dopamine, nothing else, no parenting, no nothing, and the drugs are geared towards fixing that dopamine, they're only fixing a tiny part of the problem, right? So that's what is meant by being too parochial. That was a very, very brief run through in terms of the biological approach. I do just quickly want to just make sure there's a lot written down in the workbook. This may change in subsequent versions of the workbook. I've kind of gone through that. That's fine. A phenotype, I've covered that as well. Not too bothered about that. You do want to look at the link between genetic inheritance and OCD. Look at the statistics. Look in my slides for that, actually. RAIN is a good example. RAIN 1997 found, in terms of neuroanatomy, that, and there is a good slide here which I did find that useful. I remember studying RAIN a long time ago. Why aren't you? Oh, there we go. Psychology Wizard, whatever that is. Basically finding that there were neuroanatomical issues with people who were accused of murder, basically. So it's kind of saying that they don't have any free will in that murdering people. It was just because their brain was basically damaged. And then finally, I do just want to go through neurochemistry. My advice would be know at least two or three. I probably do need to know more than that, actually, but know at least two or three biochemicals, neurotransmitters in as much detail as you can. GABA, for example. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. That main function is to quieten down the brain. Why may you want to quiet down the brain? To go to sleep, for example. So again, write that down. It's often found that people with anxiety have got low levels of GABA. They don't have that much GABA, so their brain is not calmed down, and that's exactly what a person with anxiety is like, isn't it? Their brain is going 100 miles an hour, but what if that? But then that could also happen, and they don't have any GABA to be able to calm themselves down. So again, that has huge practical implications. So we can fix that problem. Adrenaline, you do need to know. Again, to answer this, I would like you to write down at least five reactions from the body as a result of an adrenaline injection. As in you not injecting yourself, as in your adrenal glands injecting adrenaline. And then serotonin. Serotonin, most people just associate with mood, and it is associated with mood, but it's also massively important in learning and memory as well. But one thing I would like you to write down here is the problem of serotonin OCD is that the serotonin, and we will go through this in more detail later on, but the serotonin gets released from the neuron, but then it gets reuptaken too quickly. And that's the problem of OCD. The serotonin gets released from the presynaptic membrane, and before it's even got a chance to go across the synapse to the other neuron, it's being reuptaken. So the serotonin never actually reaches its destination. That is a very, very, it wasn't quick actually. I went on for quite a while there. That was a very, very long run through. But as always, have a look at the questions and email me if you have any questions. Hope this was useful.